All right, President Obama recently warned that the U.S. is facing a new Sputnik moment, a reference to the 1957 Soviet satellite launch that awakened America to how far behind it was falling in the space race. But the president wasn't talking about exploration in space or scientific progress. He was talking about education and the revelation that on a recent test, 15-year-old students in Shanghai topped the rest of the world in math and reading and science. Joining us now is Chester Finn of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, a nonprofit think tank dedicated to improving America's K-12 schools. He's also a former assistant U.S. Education Secretary. Chester, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it. This is a subject that Carol and I talk about a lot, and obviously a difficult one to find the right answer to. How do we improve America's educational system?
Well, the first thing we have to do is get serious about that and not treat that as a kind of something we do on Mondays and then we forget about it on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. We have a lot of moving parts in our education system. It includes the standards or expectations that we set for our kids, the accountability system by which we determine whether kids and teachers and schools and so forth are meeting the expectations, and whether we do anything to reward those that are and to intervene in those that aren't. We need competent teachers. We need good technology. There's a whole laundry list. But above all, we need the will to buckle down and study and learn like I think those kids in Shanghai are getting.
When you say will, I'm assuming you're not talking about money, right? Because we've seen federal funding for education increase since 1970, I think adjusted for inflation 140%, and you haven't seen scores increase really at all. We saw the ballooning budget for the Department of Education, I think $106 billion in 2010. Doesn't seem to be changing things. Is it a cultural difference that makes the Chinese sort of buckle down and do better?
They have a kind of educational nationalism going on in China right now, where the government is in effect saying to young people, university and school, if you work hard and study hard, China will be first, or China will win, or China will rule. And they're getting a lot of traction with that kind of message. I don't think we can do it that way in the United States. I don't think people want the government saying to kids, study hard in the United States, will do better. I don't think that's how we get at kids or teachers or schools. But the will means that we've got to make it really matter in the lives of individual children and teachers and principals and maybe even parents, whether they're learning what they need to learn in reading, writing, science, history, and so forth. And by really matter, I mean, do you graduate from high school without it? Do you get into college without it? Do you get prizes with it? These kinds of things. We've got to really make this tangible.
You know, Chester, so is it really kind of a value story here, if you will, or is it more of an economic story? And I think about those who are wealthy, those kids tend to finish high school, go to college, do well. Those who are just struggling to put food on their table, those families, it's much tougher. So does it have to start really making it kind of an economic story again, an economic decision, an economic focus, if you will? We've got to kind of reduce that great divide between the haves and have-nots, and education will follow.
Well, I don't think so, for two reasons. One is that a lot of those middle-class kids you're talking about, though they do go through the motions of completing high school and going to college, on these international exams, they're not doing very well either. There's a kind of complacency in the American middle class that the education problem lives in the inner city or lives on the other side of town. That's just not true. We've got all kinds of evidence right now that a lot of these suburban middle-class families don't have much achievement going on in their kids or their schools. They happen to be lovely, tranquil places, but they're not learning very much. Conversely, in some of the very best inner-city schools, and I'm including famous charter schools like the KIPP schools and so on, we see kids from very poor and disadvantaged and minority circumstances doing really well, because they're going to a school that raises their aspirations, teaches them a lot, and expects them to learn it. So I don't think it is economically determined. I mean, yeah, there's some correlation, but that's not the way to fix it.
All right, and when I look at, your story or your op-ed that you wrote in the Wall Street Journal, I mean, you talk about Shanghai. I mean, this is a city that Beijing has put a lot of attention on, a lot of investment, a lot of attention, many favorable policies. So maybe it's no surprise that they're doing so well. So what have we learned from Shanghai that you think can and should be applied to the U.S.? Excuse me.
Well, unfortunately, the first thing we've learned from Shanghai is that China has figured out how to do this, and that we can no longer kid ourselves into thinking that China makes those cheap plastic toys, but they're way behind in the education race. The fact is they've demonstrated that they're capable of winning the world education race when they put their mind to it. And Shanghai, I believe, is just the tip of this iceberg. I don't think that our job is to imitate Shanghai. We're not going to behave like the Chinese government does or the Chinese people do, but it's to do our own education reform in a really serious way with a level of commitment that we have not shown to it up until this point.
All right, hey, Chester Finn, thank you so much for joining us.